everyone, and welcome to episode 165 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Sobalski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. During the Middle Ages, Christianity was at the very heart of European society, influencing everything from literature to law. We know that the church shaped society from the top down, but how did ordinary people experience Christianity in their daily lives? Although there's evidence everywhere, it can be hard to get a comprehensive overview of what it was like to go to church in the Middle Ages. Luckily, my next guest has got it covered. This week, I spoke with Dr. Nicholas Orme about the church-going lives of everyday medieval people. Nicholas is an emeritus professor of history at the University of Exeter and the author of literally dozens of books, including one of my favorites that I've mentioned several times on this podcast, Medieval Children. His new book brings together his vast knowledge on country and church culture and is aptly called Going to Church in Medieval England. Our conversation on the expectations placed on ordinary parishioners, who was in charge of pastoral care, and what it was like to attend a medieval mass is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Nicholas, for joining me to talk about church in medieval England. It's so nice to meet you.
Thank you very much, Danièle, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to talk to you as well.
Thank you very much. Well, I was just saying to you that I recommend your book, Medieval Children, to lots of people. And this book, Going to Church, is a completely different topic for you. So why did you decide to write this book?
When I graduated, which is a long, long time ago now, back in 1962, I wanted to do research. And the topic I selected was medieval schools, because nobody had worked on these for 50 years or so, and the previous person who worked on them wasn't really very reliable. So I started to work on medieval schools, and I've spent a lot of my life writing about schools and education, how children were educated, the books they read in schools and that sort of thing. And in order to get together that information, which is very widely scattered, you have to read a lot of sources about the medieval church. You read the records of bishops and guilds and chantries and monasteries and friaries and so on. So in doing that work, I acquired a great deal of knowledge of the medieval church. When I'd exhausted schools, I went on to write the book that you kindly mentioned on medieval children. And I've got a sequel to that coming out next year, actually, which is called Tudor Children, which takes the story through the 16th century. But as I'm coming to the end of my active research life, I thought I really wanted to write up all this church history material that I've collected all my life. You see, I seem to have wandered into a mode of writing which involves gathering together little bits and pieces and making a kind of mosaic out of them. I mean, some people go for the big topics where there's an awful lot of source material, obvious source material. But I've never done that. I've always wanted to write about things that nobody else wrote about. For example, I wrote a book about the history of swimming, which is a very rare subject to write about as well. So I rather specialize in these sorts of books. And the reason why nobody has written up medieval church going is that they just think it's too difficult. It's little bits and pieces scattered. It's like archaeologists do when they do field walking and they take their instruments and they patiently cover the whole of a field and find little bits and work something out from them. So it's exactly that sort of technique.
Well, that's the thing about this book, where I think that you're right. People didn't want to take on this topic because it's way too big and you have to go to all of these disparate sources to piece it together. But at the same time, it's a fundamentally important topic because everybody needs to have an understanding of what the regular church habits were in order to understand society. So it's a really important book, I think, but I can see why other people didn't want to do it and that it spoke to you with the mosaic qualities of it. Okay, so let's get into church going in medieval England. Who's going to church? I think that's the big question. Is it everybody that's going?
No, is the simple answer. There are categories of people who are supposed to go, and there are categories who are excused. But like any legal system, if you think about driving speed limits or something like that, the fact that you've got an order for people to do something doesn't mean to say that they're going to do it. So they don't require children to go to church. The church-going requirement comes in when you reach puberty in your early teens. And then, in a sense, you become an adult member of the church and you enter on all the duties and responsibilities of being a member of the church. Then they found there were going to be difficulties about getting everybody there anyway. What you do about shepherds, for example, who are up on the hills with their sheep, or even cowherds, people who are out in the fields with animals, that would be difficult. What about fishermen? When the shoals of whatever it is come in, the fishermen have to get out after them. It's no good saying it's Sunday. They won't be there on Monday, so they have to go. And then people who inquired into this in more detail said, well, okay, how about a merchant on a Sunday who's making his way to the nearby market town to set up his stalls on Monday? Does he need to go? And there was the feeling that not really. And then if it's harvest time, which is August in medieval England, are you going to expect everybody to forego harvesting on Sunday? Well, no, I don't think we're going to do that. So there were in practice quite a lot of exemptions. And the easiest exemption of all, of course, was to say, I didn't feel very well, or it was raining very hard, and I lived 3 miles away, and there was a flooded stream in the middle. So it tends to be only people who are deliberately and frequently absent from church who get into trouble. And even there, as we know very much in my country, and I'm sure in yours too, even when you've got people who've disobeyed the law, it's an awful problem to get them into court and dealt with, because courts have got other things to do. There aren't police forces in every community and so forth. So you did get people who were brought up before church courts for refusing to go, but I rather suspect that they were the most hardened offenders, and also those people who were otherwise unpopular in society. Because again, if you look at it from the parish priest's point of view, he's got to have a relationship with his community. And unlike modern communities, he's dealing with a very small, static community. He is the priest of a parish with, let's say, 300 or 350 people, and they're all living there. So he has to have a relationship with them. And if there is somebody who is widely unpopular for this or that reason because they're antisocial, it's much easier to get the community behind you and get them into the church court. Whereas if the person is popular, even if he's a bit of a scoundrel, or she is, it's more difficult.
I think that's important, that you have expectations for who is going to show up, but they don't always show up. And you do want to chase those people, make sure that you're saving their souls, I suppose, if you're the parish priest. So we've talked about regularly there are reasons for people to miss church, but there were some moments in the year when they were definitely supposed to be there. So what were those moments during the calendar year where everybody was supposed to go to church?
Well, there were really only two. One was Easter Sunday, when everybody who was an adult was expected to receive Holy Communion. And that was an absolute given. And I think it was also, it had somehow got into social life and public consciousness. One of the things that happened on Easter Sunday, as well as going to church to receive communion, was that you took your Easter food with you and the priest blessed it. So you've got to imagine all this food, probably under cloths or something, being laid out in the churchyard, and probably children put to look after it while the adults were in church. And then the priest comes out and sprinkles holy water over it all, and they go home and eat it. Except that some people were so hungry that they started before the service was over in church, which got the authorities rather angry. So that's one day when I think everybody, or virtually everybody, was there. The other thing that you had to do as an adult was to go to church for confession during Lent, at least once a year. Lent is the 40 days between Ash Wednesday and Easter Day, and you have to go to church then. That, of course, doesn't mean everybody will be in church at the same time, because you have your little private slot with the priest, which interested me a lot. I was really not able to find how long these slots were, but I think probably they can't have been much longer than 10 or 15 minutes, because the priest would know his parishioners pretty well. So they had a rota system. You were allocated a particular day on which to come, and probably a particular time as well. The confessions would be held between about 10 and 12 in the morning, possibly in the afternoon as well. And so you queued up outside the church and you had your little slot. So those are the two occasions where you absolutely have to be in church. I think people would be in church for quite a lot of other occasions. Christmas Day is a recognised day to go. Doesn't have quite the same significance for them as it does for us. It's of less importance than Easter. Whit Sunday or Pentecost, which is 40 days after Easter, that's another one where you're supposed to go. Candlemas on the 2nd of February. Everybody, including children, goes to church, takes a candle with them, which they eventually have to offer to the priest. That's a very popular occasion to go. And then there are the rogation days. I got very interested in these because they've been very, very little studied. But Rogation Sunday is 5 or 6 weeks after Easter. And then in the following Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, you have processions round the parish. And they start from the parish church. You have Mass in the parish church at about 9 o'clock. At about 10, you set off through the fields, blessing the fields, and you make either for a chapel in the parish or the next parish church. And when you get there, you hear another Mass being celebrated, and then you have a picnic, because the whole point about Mass is you mustn't eat before going, even if you don't receive communion. You must go to Mass fasting. So on these 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, you might have had a little short breakfast when you got up, but otherwise you've gone through the whole morning, and actually quite a long trudge of 2 or 3 or 4 miles. And when the second Mass is over, you finally get down to the picnic. And there was a great deal of picnicking and drinking and hospitality as well. Lords of the Manor, for example, would offer hospitality. And it was said that the priest often couldn't find his way home afterwards.
Yes, I can imagine. There's lots of stuff about drinking priests in the Middle Ages, so I imagine this would be a common joke. Mm. So we've talked a little bit about confession, we've talked about communion. So this seems like a good opportunity to ask about the sacraments. So what sacraments were people expected to take during the course of their lives? Because I know this shifted a little bit over time.
Yeah, so the church tries to offer what you might call spiritual support at key periods of your life. So you could say it's altruistic. The church wants to give you its blessing when you're born, married, and died. But there is an element of control about it as well, I think, that the church wants to get its hands on those occasions and use it for its own purposes. So the idea develops in the early Middle Ages that you have to be baptized if you're going to go to heaven when you die. And they get into tangles then about stillborn children who technically are souls, but they haven't been baptized. So what's going to happen to them? And one theory is they go off to a place called limbo, which is on the edge of hell. It's not as bad as hell, but at the same time, they're never going to get to heaven. Really a rather depressing idea. It's not something that everybody believed by any means. So the church is insistent that you get baptized in order to gain eternal life. This is based on words attributed to Jesus in the Bible. And therefore, you should get baptized as soon as you possibly can. So baptism up to the Reformation is either on the day of birth or the next day. It's happening very, very quickly. The baby is brought from the birthing room into the church. Godparents are provided. Anybody can be a godparent other than the parents themselves. But the payoff for the church is that you become a member of the church from birth without any say in the matter. And this means that, as soon as you reach puberty, if you do, the church can say, okay, you're a member of the church. Now you're going to have to assume the adult responsibilities. So it's both blessing and payoff, I think. The same is true with marriage. Now, the church had a very equivocal view of marriage, necessarily so because the key element of marriage is nothing to do with the church. It's the two partners agreeing to marry. Nothing else is needed other than that. And the church had to admit that that was the case. And so the church recognized marriages that didn't take place in church, as long as you could prove that you had been married, which really means making sure there's a couple of witnesses present when you do it, so they can be appealed to if there's any doubt about it. But the church, again, wanted to take over marriage. It wanted to control who married who. They had very complicated rules of what's called consanguinity, who you can marry, much wider than it is nowadays. So you can't marry a first cousin or a second cousin. You can get a dispensation, actually, from the church to do it, but it's not something you can just go ahead and do. So the church is trying to get control over marriage. And then when we come to funerals, now funerals are not technically sacraments, but the medieval church funeral included a mass, and a mass is a sacrament. So nearly everybody went to the grave, having their body having been present at a mass. So you can say in that sense that a funeral is a sacrament. And there again, I think, although the church would say, yes, we're blessing the departing person, we are actually blessing the grave. That was a big part of the funeral, the digging of the grave, saying of prayers over it, the wafting of incense and putting holy water onto it. So it's a safe space after death. There's no demon can get to you when you're in your grave. And of course, the church would say it's providing consolation for the bereaved as well, that it's giving the message of hope of resurrection in another world. But I think there's a little bit of control going on here as well, because funerals, then as now, were expensive occasions. And nowadays, it's amazing, certainly in Britain, how much you can pay for a funeral, and the cars and the flowers and the other things. And there was a lot of money to be made out of funerals, and the church would like to have it. People paid offerings at the funeral mass. They bought candles to light. There was a charge for digging the grave. And the churches in towns made a considerable income out of funerals because towns were places where the mortality was greater. It was easier for epidemics to spread, and there was often urban deprivation as well. So town churches tend to have much larger numbers of funerals than rural ones do. So those are the three great sacraments. One could also mention confirmation. The church was never quite sure about confirmation. Really, you don't need confirmation, but it had been in the system for a long, long time. The idea that the bishop should also confirm the baptism that had taken place. How often people got confirmed, we don't really know, because trying to get in touch with the bishop must have been quite difficult in remote areas. But that was something you were supposed to have done. I'm trying to think of the remaining sacraments. Well, we've talked about confession. That's a sacrament as well. And the other one is unction. When you are very, very seriously ill, you can be anointed with holy oil, which is believed to be a medicine that should make you better. The trouble was that so often it didn't, that people came to regard anointing as the last possible thing you would ever have done, and they became resistant to having it until the very, very end, whereas it was really intended actually to be medicinal, and you were allowed to recover. Hopefully you would recover after having it.
Yeah, perhaps people were waiting to the last minute because they didn't want to have to confess twice, right? You want to make sure that you're clean right at the moment of death.
That's right, yes. Cleanliness from sin at the moment of death is a concern for people, particularly by the end of the Middle Ages, more so then, I think, than earlier on. And if you've got enough money, and it actually doesn't take very much money, you can get a document issued by the Pope which says, provided you confess before you die, all your sins will be forgiven. Anybody with any money got one of these, and then it was produced at their last confession and was often put into the grave with them as well. We've discovered them in grave excavations.
Well, it's always good to have insurance, right? The church is making sure that you're covered.
Exactly, yes. Yes, and that's an interesting point. We tend to regard the medieval church as a kind of repressive, controlling organization. Of course, it's hardly an organization anyway. It's more of a movement. And in fact, a lot of church history is actually driven by what people want rather than what clergy, popes, bishops want. And there's a very interesting interplay between these, with the authorities wanting some things, people wanting others, and a certain amount of give and take.
I think that's a really important point because people do tend to think in a very cynical way about the medieval church because they are taking money for indulgences and they are taking money for offerings and tithes and things like this. But it is meant to be an altruistic institution. And I think it's important to always kind of come back to that idea because that was the idea behind it, whether or not you have individuals who are exploiting the system.
Well, the church is so many different organizations in any case, and they're not always going in the same direction.
Yes.
I don't know what a modern parallel would be. I mean, in Britain, it would be education, because we've got a very complicated educational system. And we've got some schools that are following this line and others that are following that line. So you couldn't say that British education is simple at all. It's very, very complicated. And exactly the same is true of medieval religion. And for a person who lived in a country parish, they very rarely came into contact with church authorities. It was essentially this local guy who they dealt with, who was, after all, somebody rather like themselves, who came from a similar family. That was their experience of the church, and not anything much other than that. So for most people, church life was, yes, going to church, having the sacraments, taking part in these things like the rogation processions, certain rules about behaviour, but then the rules were those that most people would have thought necessary anyway. You know, not carving up people you didn't like or going after somebody else's wife. I mean, the church said you shouldn't, but equally, I mean, that wasn't different from what a non-church society would have believed anyway.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is a great time to talk about what people's experience was within the church, because as you say, most people are not reading Thomas Aquinas on their own. They're mostly just going to church. So one of the things that you have done in the book is you've laid out some blueprints of what the church looks like. So can you tell us a little bit about what it would be like to go to a service in the Middle Ages? What does it look like within the building? Are you sitting and standing? Are you singing? Can you walk us through some of that stuff?
Yes, I mean, that varies with time. And my book covers a very long period of time, as you know. It goes from about the year 600 to 1560. So it's nearly 1,000 years. And there are a lot of changes in that time. One of the interesting things that happened was the introduction of seating, which appears to have come in during the 14th century, the 1300s, about the time of Chaucer. We don't absolutely know, because we just don't have any surviving church fittings or furnishings before then. But the references in literature seem to indicate that before that time, very important people have got seats in church, but the majority haven't. So they are presumably standing, and there's probably some gender differentiation. I mean, it always strikes me as interesting when you get meetings that men and women do tend to do this automatically anyway. But they had a much more restricted idea of women's activities than we do. So I think there was a feeling that women should be together and that men, to a certain extent, should keep aloof from them. Although there's the problem then of husbands and wives, and they may not want to separate. It's very, very difficult to say. But in the late 1300s, seating comes in. And it's not anything that the church authorities ever imposed. It's entirely the invention of lay people, which is another of my aspects of how the church develops from underneath as well as from on top. And once there are quite a lot of seats, everybody wants to have a seat. And then you've got to have some kind of differentiation of the seats. Now, that doesn't bother us today. I mean, we're just glad to get somebody into a church and they can sit wherever they want. But in those days, when you might have everybody from the parish there, society wants the ranks of society to be recognised. So there are seats for particular people. The Lord of the Manor will be in the chancel, in the holy part of the church, with the clergy. He and his family, or she, the Dowager Lady and her servants, will be there. If there are any other gentry in the parish, they will be inside chapels, very often screened off, so you can't get into those areas. You have to understand that a lot of a medieval church might be private area. And if you come over to here, to England, and go round enough of our churches, you'll see that some of these screens are still in place that were once private areas. And the majority of the population will be in the nave, which is the public part of the church, facing towards the chancel. And there will be a series of benches. The wealthy farmers will be up at the front, and the further down the church you go towards the back, the lower in status will be those who are sitting in it. Sometimes servants sit with their employers, because if you're a servant to somebody important, that gives you status that an ordinary person doesn't have. Otherwise, sometimes servants are right at the back, or children are right at the back, or they're standing because there aren't enough seats for them. So if you had been able to go into a parish church in 1500, when there were a lot of people there, you would have had a visual breakdown of the society of the parish.
It's funny that it breaks down in church like that as well, because it breaks down like that pretty much everywhere. At the dinner table, at festivals, at tournaments, it's always laid out. You can always tell who someone is in society from where they are sitting or standing.
That's right, yes. Perhaps not quite so much nowadays, but certainly in those days. And then if we go on from seating to what is your experience of a service? The services are in Latin. And so the analogy I always use for this is music. Suppose you go to hear a Beethoven symphony. Unless you're musically literate, you don't know really what's going on musically. You just hear a nice tune and some variations of it. So you connect with it emotionally without quite understanding what's been going on. And that is how it would have been in a church service up to 1549, when the services were translated into English. You will know your way around the services because they have the same form, which is repeated from Sunday to Sunday. So with a Mass, for example, which is the main service that people go to, it's about 8 or 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning. As I've said before, you're not supposed to have had much to eat before you go. It lasts about an hour, or perhaps a little bit longer. So you will know the shape of it, the various elements of it as they follow one another. You will not be expected to take part in it in any oral sense. There are no responses, there are no prayers to be said together, there's nothing like that. So what do? There are certain moments at which you ought to stand or kneel. These will be understood by the community, and children will be brought up to observe them. You can't say what they are because nobody has really written them down, but there must have been a sequence of things that you did. And then you take with you a book, if you're literate, a prayer book, not necessarily the book that the clergy are using, although some very literate people do. They actually have their own copy of what the priest is reading from, and they can follow it. But it's much more common to take a very simple prayer book, which was known as the Book of Hours, and you just read through that, but it's not the same as what is going on in the chancel, curiously enough. So you'd have had this murmur of voices from literate people as they were saying over that, alongside what was going on further up the church with the clergy. If you haven't got a prayer book, you take a rosary with you. And a rosary is a chain of beads. And you say the 3 basic prayers, the little beads of the Hail Mary, and you say 10 of those. Then you say a Pater Noster or a Lord's Prayer. And then when you finish the whole thing, you say the Creed. So you're doing that. If you haven't got a rosary, you just have to be there silently praying or venerating an image. Churches will have a lot of art. So almost certainly from where you are in the church, you'll be able to see an image of the Virgin Mary or some other saint. You could be looking at her and offering her up your prayers. And then there comes the supreme moment of the Mass, which is when the priest consecrates the bread and wine, which he does up at the altar. And according to their belief from the 1100s onwards, when the words of Christ are spoken over the bread and wine, they become the real body and blood of Christ. Not simply representational or symbolic, but actual. And because at that stage of the Mass, there's no noise. The priest is saying the prayer of consecration quietly or silently. He holds up the consecrated wafer, first of all, and a clerk rings some little bells to draw your attention, then holds up the chalice. A little bit later, he holds up the chalice and the wafer together. And that's the supreme moment which you should kneel and venerate Christ, as they believe, really present in the church. At the end of the service, there's a substitute for communion, which, as I've said, they only get on Easter Sunday morning. And this is the Holy Loaf. Each family in the parish has to contribute the loaf 1 week of the year, and there ought to be a rota for doing this. And the bread is brought up and offered. The priest sprinkles some holy water on it, and then the parish clerk cuts it up, and everybody gets a little bit. And again, I think it goes round in social order. So the grandees get it first, and then it gradually goes down the social order. You chew your little bit of bread, and then you go out, and that's your substitute for communion. But the interesting thing I found was that although the services were in Latin, English was creeping in as well, and that by the 15th century at least, some of the material that was being sung was in English. In the middle of the service, they had a period when English was used, and they gave out the calendar for next week, for example. Such and such a saint is coming up on this particular day, and you ought to be in church that day if it's one of the major festivals, or you should fast the previous evening, because that's also an obligation on some of the major days. So make sure you do that. Then there will be various bits of business. Sometimes there are excommunications. And these must have been quite interesting, because they would be a bit like reading the headlines in the Sunday newspaper, really. So-and-so has been excommunicated for doing this, that, and the other. Or in some cases, it was those unknown who have been poaching in the bishop's deer park. And you imagine people saying to each other, I know who that was. Yeah. I'm not saying anything. Pardoners, if you've ever read Chaucer, there's a lot about pardoners going into church. They are charity collectors, essentially. So they're coming in and saying, please give your money for this hospital or this bridge project. And there's a really good payoff here, because there's an indulgence offering so much off your penance for your sins if you give money for it. And then the other thing they do is bidding prayers. This is something that I think all churches would now have in their services. That is to say, you go through praying for the church, the government, those in need, the departed. And in some churches, they read out long lists of the departed. You can pay money, not a lot actually, a few shillings, to have your name put on the roll. And this is then read out. I'm not sure whether they did it every Sunday, but they certainly did it occasionally. So you actually would get a lot of family history in a service, at least from one time to another. It would probably go through the last 200 years, and people would think, yeah, well, that was my great-granddad, and so forth. That's all very interesting as well. So it's not just the Latin service. It does try to involve people, not nearly enough by the view of those who came afterwards in the Reformation, by any means. But it wasn't an entirely alien experience. It was trying to build bridges with the congregation.
Yeah, I think that everything you've said just now really reflects the fact that it is a bridge. It's the place where people can get together, where they can exchange news, where they can find out the gossip about who is getting married, who's getting excommunicated. It is the place where they can find out everything they need to know for the week.
And that is That is why church attendance will happen. You see, there's very little going on in the countryside on a Sunday, and the alehouses are not supposed to be open until after church is over. So, yes, go to church. It's a way of socialising. If you've been working on a farm or a peasant holding all the week, you may not have seen anybody very much. And so to get together on a Sunday, share the gossip and so on, go to something. I suspect that children as well were around church, even though they didn't need to be. And they could have been a bit of a pest, I think, because if they were young, of course, they didn't really understand what was going on and babies would be yelling. We do actually have complaints about this. And I suspect older children were getting up to a bit of mischief and probably getting a few clouts as well for doing it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, this is a good place for children to meet other children because during the week they're working. So if they're not in school or if they're not working with other children, they may not meet other children. I could see this being a place where children would look forward to going to just to see their friends.
That's right, yes. And churchyards are another place for people to meet because they're a designated open space in a village. I mean, everything else may be somebody's garden or a field, but the churchyard is an open area, and it becomes a very tempting place to play games. And the church doesn't like that because the churchyard is consecrated ground, and they want it treated with respect. So there's a lot of tension, which I talk about in the book, over churchyards and the desire of people to do things there that they shouldn't, which can range from letting your sheep in to eat up the grass, and indeed to encounters of a certain kind which needed a bit of privacy and which you couldn't get in your own parents' house.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, we still have stories throughout the Middle Ages of this happening in churchyards and even monastic churchyards or at the middle of the town. The churchyard is a place to meet people, whether that is meeting people illicitly or illicitly. Well, there's so much more that is in this book, but I really want to thank you for coming on the podcast today, because I do think that people perhaps have a habit of thinking of the church as a separate thing. And I really appreciate the way you've brought it to the heart of the community in a way that I think we need to be reminded of when we are learning about the Middle Ages.
Yes, the other thing I would like to say is that every church is different.
Yes.
There's no standard church for all sorts of reasons, because historically parishes are of different sizes, different wealth. All the buildings are different. There's no absolutely standard template. So this is our church of our community, and the one next door is very, very slightly different. And that's, again, important for understanding the medieval church. Don't necessarily think of it as a monolith. It's really like a whole lot of little beads all being sort of shaken up in a cylinder or something.
Yes, well, I think it's important to remember that too. It's being shaped by the bishop of the community. It's being shaped by the parish priest. It's being shaped by individuals. So thank you for that reminder.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much indeed, Danielle.
To find out more about Nicholas's work, you can find his CV at humanities.exeter.ac.uk/history/staff/Orme. His new book is Going to Church in Medieval England. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on this week, Peter?
Hey. Well, I have found the secrets of learning if a woman is in love with you or not.
Well, that's something that you needed help with?
Every man needs help with that, but it's a 14th century Catalonian anonymous writer. I assume he was a man. He wrote a book on the art of love. He has this wonderful little section of what are the telltale signs that a woman is in love with a man. And it involves sighing and yawning.
Sighing and yawning, those
Yes.
are love signs.
It seems like those are ones you really need to look out for.
Okay. Then we will all be on the lookout for sighs and yawns, I think, next time we all head out.
Indeed, indeed. So, yeah, we put that piece online. I got a lot of great articles from our writers. There's one about beating the heat, handheld fans in medieval China.
Well, I mean, they know about heat in China. So, I mean, we can all use all the help we can get.
Yeah. So it's just like kind of fascinating stuff. That's from Elizabeth Smith Rosser. We have a piece on what heralds did, particularly at tournaments. They were like causing trouble. That's what they did.
That was their official job,
That
causing
was,
trouble.
yeah, literally, it seems that was their job, was just cause problems with the crowds, yell at each other. That was what they were doing.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading that one because when you're saying this, all I can think about is Paul Bettany in A Knight's Tale.
Yeah. I think that's dead on, right? So we've got that. Also, Adam Alley on like a 16th century pirate queen in the Mediterranean. And we've got one on an 11th century Kievan Rus princess who becomes empress. Yeah, lots of kind of fun stuff this week on the site.
That's amazing. All of these women. I can't wait to read those ones too. Wow, it's a good lineup you got this week.
Indeed it is. It was always fun getting all these articles from our writers. Gotta get them up.
Absolutely. Well, I guess you better get on that. I've been writing some stuff too. Did you know that?
Indeed. You got this mini book.
Yeah, I have a mini book. It's kind of a white paper, and it's a little bit weird to talk about it on a podcast that's just been talking about church and religion, but it is a resource that I created for writers because I'm always hearing that the letters that they get from readers are always about how they're sexy words and their swears are anachronistic. So what I did was I mined the Oxford English Dictionary because this is the best source for etymology that we have. Like, it can be a little bit slow in updating, but it is almost bulletproof. And so I mined it for all of the earliest instances of the dirtiest words you can think of for all of those writers who are trying to write racy scenes, and they're trying to do it in a historical fashion. So this is a resource I've created called 300 plus dirty, sexy words for historical writers. Yes.
It is awesome. Oh, I loved like the hearing, hey, when does insult actually start being used? Or even romantic words.
Yeah. So most of the words have to do with like body parts and sex acts, because these are the things that people are describing when they're creating human relationships in these stories. But a lot of the words that we think of as dirty words now have to do with the body. So I made a whole section of just insults. A lot of people's favorite swear words are in that section. So these are timelines. So if you're writing something that takes place in like 1500 or even 1700, then you can look at all the words that were available to you at that time. So it goes from Old English to the early 1970s.
Yeah, it's awesome. I think it'd be a great resource. I think I'll make use of it too. If you're a writer, man, like, hey, I can make use of this. This is what people said on the streets, right, at this time. So if you're in historical fiction, I think this is a must get.
Yeah, well, thanks, Peter. I worked very hard on this, and I'm hoping that people like it. It's something that you can use if you're a writer, a screenwriter, somebody who's writing for games too, or even people who just want their role-playing games to be, as accurate as possible, because I know there are a lot of people who are devoted to that. So you can get that on my website, which is daniellesabelski.com/shop. And I should mention that over the past few years, I was writing these survival guides. So my most famous one is How to Survive the Zombie Apocalypse. But I wrote a couple other ones like How to Survive a Romance Novel and How to Survive Your Comic Book Nemesis. And you can get those all on my newly created shop there, as well as the new sexy dirty words list.
And this is stuff that it may come in very handy. I think I have many comic book nemesises.
Yes.
Is it nemesis? I don't.
It's probably nemesis, but we're going to have people writing in to tell us and correct us on it. Well, thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's going on this week. Thanks. Thank you, as always, to medievalist.net's patrons on patreon.com. Patrons can sign up for all sorts of great rewards like subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, as well as ad-free versions of medievalist.net and exclusive maps by Tina Ross. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider signing up for Patreon, as your patronage directly funds both my podcast and others hosted by medievalist.net. If you're already a patron, rest assured that you have my undying gratitude. Thank you. For everything from parishes to perishables, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. The digital resources I was just talking with Peter about are available at daniellecybulski.com/shop. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening and have yourself an awesome day.